A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes as well as entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. This week, that would be through chapter 20. Through chapter 20. Hey there, this is Cross.
And I'm PJ.
And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
So we pushed our recording by a day because Crossland was feeling a little stuffy. I believe what he said was dripping out of all of his orifices. And turns out he's still got a pretty cracky voice based on that intro right there.
I do. I'm not perfect yet, but I am much better. At the very least, I was maybe every 2 seconds just like it was just the worst. And I was like, there's no way that either of us are going to want to edit that shit out because it's going to be so annoying. So yeah, we're doing this a day later than expected, but all told, at the very least, I'm not dying anymore, I guess would be a way to put it. But yeah, no.
Yeah.
With that, today is our third episode discussing The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, and we are going to chat about chapters 14 through 20. But before we do that, and before we talk about what we're drinking, we have to let you know that yesterday, our new show, The Catacomb Party and the Tales of Kana, has been released. Our first 2 episodes are out now, so go listen to them. It's a great time. It's a tabletop role-playing game where we roll dice and we mostly improv act. We've got some great sound design and production. There's, imagine all of the fancy flashy things that you'd want in a TV show, but audio form. It's a ton of fun.
While we be goofy and, I don't know, try to stumble through the world. It's great. It's a lot of fun.
You'll be able to find a link, as always, in our show notes, so you can check that out. It will be in the show notes so that you can go find it. But you should be able to find it on your podcatcher of choice by searching Catacomb Party and the Tales of Kana. Beyond that, in our short pour, we will also have the first episode of our Talk available in case you are curious and can't find it. Or if for some reason you are listening to this later, that's just another prompt, another thing to listen to. So super excited for everyone to hear it. You can go find it now.
Yeah. And
cool.
You should.
Yeah, it's so fucking good. We listened to it literally right before this, which is why we're coming in a little hot.
We are.
As far as, not that hot, but a little bit. But before we talk about the book, PJ, to get back on topic, let's talk about what we're drinking today. So, PJ, what you drinking?
Well, I had some champagne open. I believe both of us did. Because
yes,
we wanted to celebrate a little bit. We released this new show, so I decided to expand upon my Deposed King into Mistborn, and I think I found the recipe I like the most, based on sort of those themes. I'm calling it the Philosopher Tyrant. It is 2 ounces of bourbon, half an ounce of rosemary simple syrup, half an ounce of hibiscus liqueur, 2 or 3 dashes of grapefruit bitters, all stirred, strained into a coupe glass, lemon twist, and topped with champagne. So swapped out the absinthe and the Peychaud bitters and the Lillet Blanc, made it a little bit drier, cut back on the sweetness from both of the sweet elements, and yeah, overall I think it is the cocktail I was setting out to make to begin with. So I'm really really happy with it.
Cool. It sounds really tasty. What my mental note when you were saying that was like I was imagining it like an advertisement, right? You've got the Philosopher Tyrant doing what must be done. It's like your tagline for the cocktail. So
yeah, there you go. What are you drinking?
I am having a French 75. I also had champagne open because we were celebrating via the live stream for our first show with a quick Q&A. So we all popped champagne, variously or sparkling beverages of our choice. And so I decided to make a cocktail with it. And what I've got is a French 75. Really simple. Basically what you do, 3 ounces of champagne, 1 ounce gin, half an ounce of simple syrup, half an ounce of lemon juice, I haven't tried it yet to check if it's decent. Here we go. Good news. It tastes good. Yeah. So it's a good drink all told. And, I think it's just it's a classic cocktail. Like, this is a very kind of, I honestly, I feel like it's kind of the king of champagne cocktails, or like generally regarded as the one to go to.
Yeah, at least it and its derivatives are
right.
all kind of in there. Is it pre-prohibition? I think it might be.
I think it is, because it was a World War I cocktail.
Okay.
Which makes it pre-prohibition. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Because it's named after the French 75 millimeter guns that they were using.
Right.
During World War I.
What a time.
Yeah. I remember it fondly. Do you have a back half beer, or are you?
I do. God damn it.
Sometimes I'm funny.
A fruit punch sour from Youngblood Beer Co. It is called Spelling Expert, spelled SPELLINGEXPIRT.
Nice.
Sour ale with watermelon, passion fruit, orange, and guava. So only like 4.2%. So nice, light, fruity sipper.
Nice.
Do you have one? Or are you
Tasty.
just doing that one?
I mean, there's the rest of the mum, which is over there, which there's about a half a bottle of. Yep. So that'll come into play at some point. To follow it up, though, really what I'm having that I will be drinking first before the champagne is actually after the champagne probably is Edward Teach's Devil's Son IPA. It's their mainstay. I meant to have it on the show. I'm also going to claim that I'm having it on this show as celebration for the second season renewal of Our Flag Means Death. So
that's a great show.
The
if
show
you haven't
so
watched
good.
it, absolutely do. It's so much
The
fun.
show is so good. Cool. So before we talk about the chapters themselves, PJ, what was your overall feeling about this week's reading? How you feeling?
Sad. I felt sad for most of it.
Yeah?
Like, there's a whole lot of feelings from basically every perspective. There's nothing happy that happens that I can think of. There's one thing, but I mean, it comes from trauma, so I don't know about that. Yeah, this was a feelings episode, I felt like.
Okay. A feelings week as we kick into the book proper.
What about you? How's this? It's unfair to ask you because
I love the exposition of this chapter of this week. I think that it does a great job establishing and kind of starting to bring our attention to dots that our brains may not have been focused on up until this point. So I think it does a really good job of simultaneously asking and answering important questions in a satisfying way.
Yeah,
so
that tracks.
Yeah. That's kind of my feeling without getting into it too much, because like you said, it's a little bit unfair for me to talk, but I really enjoyed some of the character moments in here, and we're going to talk about those. To kick it off, we go into chapter 14 with the logbook here. Ruin's consciousness was trapped by the Well of Ascension, kept mostly impotent. That night, when we discovered the well for the first time, we found something we didn't understand. A black smoke clogging one of the rooms. Though we discussed it after the fact, we couldn't decide what that was. How could we possibly have known the body of a god, or rather the power of a god, since the two are really the same thing? Ruin and preservation inhabited power and energy in the same way a person inhabits flesh and...
Well, so to jump to the first sentence of that, because we got a lot there, but focusing on that first sentence, mostly impotent, I think answers a lot of questions for me, because talking about like the mists killing people before they released Ruin from the well, I don't know. I was wrestling with that a little bit internally. Like, how did that happen? If he was trapped, he had to have some influence. And then without explicitly saying it, kind of helped me confirm it, that it was like he still had influence, it still had influence, but it was mostly suppressed. So I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but it's whatever. Did they ever mention the smoke during their assault on the well? Like their trek to the well?
So they do mention a black smoke seeming to swirl above and around the lanterns as they're going down. And then that is like literally them walking up to the well. And then that chapter that they mentioned the black smoke in is where Ruin is released, where
Gotcha.
he shouts, "I'm free."
Right.
So it is in the same section.
Okay. And I guess my final note on that is I'm pretty anxious to find out more about preservation so I can actually parse any of this information, because I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what the relation to Ruin is, if they're connected, if it's like a yin-yang sort of situation, if it's just two entities that are at war with each other, or if they should be balanced. I don't know. I don't know what's up.
Did you remember that you kind of predicted a yin-yang structure of power?
I think I did, yeah.
Yeah. And the idea of the Hero of Ages being the good and the deepness being the bad.
Yep.
Yeah. That was a long fucking time ago.
So,
very early on in the Well of Ascension.
the puny humans.
Puny humans. Puny tiny humans.
Not even in the same realm of power.
No, and that seems to be obvious from the logbooks that we get this week as well. Is it very much paints these things as preternatural in a big way. Cool. All right. We've got more to talk about, of course, with the logbooks over the course of this week, but we pick up this week, story-wise, in a brand new perspective, that of Spook's, and he's flaring tin. I think this is important because it kind of gets into that delineation, right, where burning versus flaring, and he's constantly burning, but he's flaring to enhance senses in moments. That said, he's been burning it nonstop for a very long time. We were told, of course, in the first book by Ham, that burning metals for a long time is very dangerous and can have pronounced effects. Here we're seeming to see that start to happen to Spook. He's left with a strange impression of the sky during the nighttime to him now, and it's this incredibly brilliant lit dark sky made manifest in a million tiny little suns everywhere. And the reason why he started doing this and burning this metal this way is because of the pain and guilt from Clubs' death that we really kind of got to sit in him with for a bit at the end of the last book with Elend. Man, it's a tough moment here to kick it off with Spook.
Yeah. This perspective was really, really impressive for me because like I love that we get this perspective from Spook, but honestly, he wore his emotions on his sleeve well enough that like basically there's no new feelings so much that we get from him. Like it was all so well described just outwardly from other people's perspectives. And I feel like that really speaks to his character and how open and honest he is with the people that he surrounds himself with and chooses to be open with. But like he is exactly what he presents himself as, which was really cool to see.
Yeah, I really enjoy that too. He very much wears his heart on his sleeves, and by heart, I mean, you could say his insecurities are very outwardly focused, and otherwise other people are in tune with them because he's obvious, like a 15, 14, 16-year-old would be in the previous, parts of the books that we've read. So, you've got your teenager that's really kind of going through this. And of course, all of his emotions are out and very apparent and everyone can read him. And then moving into his perspective, it's like, oh, okay. Not that there isn't any more depth to his emotion, but it's very easy to immediately relate to him because we already have an understanding. We already have kind of a top level of what he's feeling.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's masterful switching into his perspective. Fruit fly just like flew out of nowhere. It was very strange. Considering I have traps, I was very weirded out by that. Anyway, so Spook donning his Ninja Turtle or Demon Hunter like stretch of cloth over his eyes with his glasses underneath, roams the streets of Urteau, the hereditary home of the Venture line, as well as that of the mysterious citizen of whom has taken control of the city. And that's kind of where we find ourselves. I love this sort of scene setting here that we get between both the character building moments of Spook and his glasses and this intro to the citizen.
So I can accept the comparison to like the Ninja Turtles or like what would you say, Demon Hunter?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. This feels way more explicitly Daredevil to me because there's no eye holes.
It does, and I'm so glad you put it that way because I literally, as I said at this desk right now, right here, I have a poster of Daredevil on my wall because Daredevil is my favorite superhero. And this is one of my favorite panels that I've ever seen ever. And so I have it on my wall from a comic book. And, you know, I knew I get Daredevil vibes. I just wanted to see if you got Daredevil vibes. You know,
Sure.
Sometimes it's about not inserting the idea in your head, but seeing if you get the idea. Because I do think I made mention of it later in the notes specifically. So early on here, I wanted to see like if you got the same idea, the same feeling. So
Perfect.
I don't know. That was just my. But yeah, I'm with you. This is totally like that extra sensory perspective of like he feels every individual thing, and it's not like the Daredevil depiction from the Ben Affleck movie where all of a sudden he has sonar, but instead like a reaction to things and understanding where things hit, and you know, kind of the all sorts of goodness. It's so well described. I also really enjoy the world building that's done for the city here within Spook's chapters. The patrols that can barely see past their face because of the mist reflections, the street slots where we were these dried up canals that cannot be fixed, and just kind of the general vibe from Spook as he's walking around the city, as the man is so attentive to detail that everything becomes a lot sharper than any of the other perspectives are, because he has his own sharp lens on the world. I just think it's really so well done.
Yeah, totally becomes sharper. And I feel like this is a great, clever way for Branderson to like get hyper granular in his detail and introduce like this really detailed understanding of the setting and the scenario and like what's around without jumping out of that first person view, you know? And maybe it's just kind of a flex on his descriptive writing, but it felt, if it was to be used that way, it felt really well done.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think one of the things that hits me inside of this is all of that extra description, right? And I'm trying to remember exactly what it's called. I think so. If we go back to the very first description where he's describing the sky as bright with like a million stars lighting it up, it reminds me of I think it's Trell, who is one of the first gods that Sazed mentions all the way back in Mistborn. Trellism, where it's like the million stars in the sky versus the one god and like the power that they have all the way back then. It evokes that same imagery for me of him being able to kind of see this sort of extra planner kind of thing. I don't know. I really dig it. It's nice. Yeah. It's so good. It also makes me want everyone else to be on the same level. You know what I mean? Like I kind of feel cheated when we go to other chapters a little bit because other people are paying proper attention to what they feel is necessary. Like it adds a layer onto the other parts of the story, because like Sazed is sad and we feel Sazed's sadness profoundly inside of his perspective. But I wish he would just look up and like look around and like tell us in detail what he sees. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
But what
instead, wallowing Sazed. That's all we get.
We'll get there. And I think while we're talking about this, Spook's newfound powers as well are incredibly unique. His ability to feel pebbles as needles when he's walking on them. It's a mirror into this person who just feels so broken by his desire to do and to be something for people, because he feels like he can do more and pushes himself to a dire extreme in the forms of how he's abusing his abilities for himself too.
So weirdly, it's similar to what Sazed is doing, but he's actually like getting something out of it.
True. Fair point. Yeah.
Like it is flogging himself to a certain extent. He is punishing himself for guilt. And no matter how you cut that, that's going to be a negative. But at least he's getting some utility out of it, I guess.
Yeah. At the very least, he's got some use for what's going on and kind of the tangible things that he's being hit with. Yeah. I agree with that. We then move we've been talking kind of superfluously about a lot of the description of the world, but I don't think that any of the description here is superfluous, but I think the really big plot beat is A, to catch us up on what we later know is savantism within Spook and what that looks like. And then B, to kind of set the stage for what's going to happen the rest of the week within kind of the city and what Spook is really doing right now. And so we then move to his spy moment, and we are introduced to two characters. The citizen, of course, of whom is Quellion, of whom was named in the previous book, and his kind of secrets, as well as his devotion to the survivor, the Ska, and ousting any trace of noble blood, kind of like how Doxson was speaking previously. And his sister, Beldra. I kind of want to ask, what'd you make of these two siblings and the trajectory established for our dear Spook for the rest of the week and kind of going forward?
So I guess it's going to be hard to divorce this thought from what we know going forward and like the interactions later. So I don't think I'll really even try. There's this obvious air of sadness to her. And I don't quite understand the relationship between the two of them. But based on the limited amount of time we've spent observing them, she seems pretty stuck and unhappy. But then again, this is coming from Spook, who is very clearly like fawning over her, and maybe he is similarly to Sazed, only looking out for what he wants to see. Even being that hyper aware of everything, like maybe he's still a teenage boy looking for like some in the girl of his dreams.
I think that's
apparently is like horrible sadness. So that's fucked up, but this is Spook we're talking about, so who knows?
Yeah. I don't want to say that like he's looking for his in as in like a way to like manipulate. Like he's not a Breeze-ish type.
No, not like that.
I know that's not what you're saying. I just want to clarify for audience's sake. But I do think that it is very much a teenage boy move. Like the idea that he's trying to figure her out without knowing her and without asking, which is a very teen thing to do. You know what I mean? To make assumptions from a distance based on your impression of people versus actually like talking with them and interacting and exchanging information to know something about someone. You're entirely driving it based on assumptions.
This isn't here, so maybe it doesn't belong, but kind of pointing out he's obviously very, very perceptive and he can see crazy distances, but he doesn't know the color of her eyes until he's right next to her. Mm-hmm. So like, how great is his read actually from that long of a distance? And how can he tell the sadness in her eyes when he can't actually see her eyes?
Again, I think that's an impression that he's getting because of his age. Mm-hmm. I truly think that I agree with you. And I think that this is one of the fun things about Sazed's perspective, or not Sazed, Spook's perspective, is that it's not that he's an unreliable narrator, because I don't think that. I don't think he's necessarily an unreliable narrator, but he is kind of a tainted narrator. Mm-hmm. He is kind of, he's got a perspective, obviously. And some of that perspective is the way that he literally perceives the world. And then on top of that, you have to layer in his age, which I think is really important to color his decision-making process and everything that he does. So
exactly.
Yeah. I really like it. I really enjoy Spook's chapters. They're great additions onto the story here, especially this week. With that, we move into chapter 15. So we start off here with the logbook, of course. The Ash. I don't think the people really understood how fortunate they were. During the 1,000 years before the collapse, they pushed the ash into rivers and piled it up outside of cities, generally just let it be. They never understood that without the microbes and plants Rashik had developed to break down the ash particles, the land would quickly have been buried. Though, of course, that did eventually happen anyway.
I gotta say, man, I love the depth to the logic of everything that's happened with the reshaping of the world. It's absolutely amazing. It is so great to be able to have these really specific questions about things and know that there's an answer to it. At least that's the way it feels. It feels like it is entirely fleshed out to the point where there could be very specific physical rules and equations and stuff that probably fairly similarly matches our world, but is maybe a little bit different and is still fleshed out. That's the vibe I'm getting.
I think so. I think that this is really meant to be like and kind of like I said at the beginning, part of the reason that I like this section so much is that it reinforces that everything that you've questioned maybe has been thought out. everything that you've added or that's been nagging at the back of your mind about this world and about this universe is just he's just starting to click the gears one at a time just to see if you're noticing that they all start to click and fit. Yeah.
So I guess the question is, are those meant to be filled, or did he find the holes and like fill them later? Great
question. So I think what's so difficult to answer about that question is that I think that a lot of writers, and I think that this almost universally applies, is that when you're writing a trilogy or like a series or something like that, you notice things that are wrong after you've passed the point. Like once you publish something, it's basically the text that you have to adhere to, right? Like you cannot really change the rules. Otherwise you break people's immersion, you break people's logic, you pull them out. Unless there's a gap that you can fill to add context to a missing rule or missing understanding. And I think that there are a number of interviews with writers out there that you can listen to in which they'd say, we all seem like a genius in book 3. We all seem like we planned the whole thing out in book 3. And if we didn't, we're not really doing our jobs. So I think that there's a degree to that there. This series was written, though, back to back to back. So like the books were written all at once. So I have a tough time believing that by the time that Brandon got to book 3, he hadn't edited to place things in book 1. So all that to say, I don't think he had kind of the same, I don't want to say inconsistencies because I don't think that's it, but I don't think he was adhering to the same kind of rules that someone might if they sold their first book before they wrote the second one, because he wrote the entire trilogy as this one cohesive thing.
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. That said, there are a couple of other books. There's one other book series that I can think of that's, I mean, obviously The Lord of the Rings was written that way. So like, let's not even kid ourselves. That was all one tome. But also The First Law was written that way. The first 3 books in The First Law, it was all written in the same format. So yeah, it's not uncommon, but a lot of authors don't do it that way. So it's tough to say. It's tough to say where on that side he lies. I tend to believe that Brandon planned a lot more than a lot of authors do.
I could believe that. This system is complex enough, and anytime I've pointed out something that feels like a contradiction, it's not even a contradiction, but feels like a bending of the rules, there is reason behind it. Beyond just like, maybe it is just written in reason, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt on that. It feels well planned.
Feels more like you're missing a rule, or that you were missing a rule to begin with, and the characters were, because of the way that they were taught, was incomplete, versus an appending of a rule. That's how I think about it, because there are a lot of times that it feels cheap. I've read books where like things feel cheap that way. This doesn't feel cheap. It feels like it was, oh, duh. It's because she had an incomplete training from Kelsier. She didn't really get it, you know?
Yeah.
All right. So we read the logbook here. We start off the chapter with Vin contemplating the mists and how natural they are, how different, and how they've changed over the years since the death of the Lord Ruler, since she picked them up and used them the last time. This is a really interesting start to the chapter, as far as like reminding us of the mists a little bit, reminding us of kind of the different points in the story in which they've popped up and helped her out, which I think feeds a lot of what goes on in the rest of the chapter. What'd you make of the mists?
So we get some context to this in a logbook entry later, talking about how there are people that it like embraces and people that it pushes away from. What I'm trying to remember, and I haven't taken the time to actually look back through Mistborn into that battle with Lord Ruler, but I feel like I remember the mists interacting with him in a similar way. Or am I just pulling that out of my ass?
So I don't recall. The tough part is that the mists seem to channel into Vin and they didn't normally go inside. I don't know that they avoided the Lord Ruler.
Okay.
And I want to also just softball throw even in as an explanation as maybe there weren't enough mists in the room. It's not as though the room was suffused with mists. It was more like it was leaking in.
That's true.
But I want to say, right, I want to say that we didn't get something so explicit.
Okay.
Now, there is in the back of my brain, there is an itching that asks, in the scene with Kelsier and the Lord Ruler, did we see the mists?
That was
and I
during
don't
the day.
think so. Yeah, that's what I thought. I was like, I don't think we saw anything there. So back when the Mists obeyed that rule. So
Yep. Yep.
Needless to say, I just wanted to, that was my thought too, is when you posed that question, I was like, piecing back through, I don't think we had enough Mists to really get to the Lord Ruler, and the only other interaction that we really had was Kelsier. So,
okay.
But this has you contemplating it.
Yeah.
The end of this chapter, we're talking about the Mists being the enemy.
There's that. Yeah. There's that too.
So I think we can tie that together when we get there. Okay. So obviously this is a short chapter. We jump to Vin listening in on Ham and Elend having a conversation about what to do about the soldiers as they march to take Fadrix. Ham argues for protecting the lives of the men as he's deeply embedded himself in them, and Elend makes the case for that being completely unreasonable, slowing them down and making it more costly in a number of ways, including lives in the end to take Fadrix and the cash that is there. Ham walks away, and Vin and Elend have a strange conversation that follows, one where she says that Ham was chosen for the wrong task by Kelsier. At this point, what do you think about Kelsier's choice of like appointing him, as well as Elend's self-proclaimed callous thoughts about the soldiers' lives? And Vin's reaction to all of that.
Yeah. At this point, I think I'm just going to jump on the bandwagon of trusting Kelsier's decisions.
Okay.
I totally get the point of view that there needs to be an emotional separation between like general and soldier. But at the same time, I can imagine the benefits of having a totally personable rapport with all of the soldiers. Like, there has to be a balance there. And I believe that Kelsier would have associated like more with the idea of being personally connected, especially considering that he seemed to do that. Like when he was like basically planning on jumping in and facing his own death just to kind of fight with the men that were fighting for him. You know, when the Ska Rebellion was kind of crushed and Vin followed. I can't remember what city that was.
Was it that Luthadel?
Was it Luthadel?
We really haven't been to any other cities.
But they had to take the Alamantic Highway. And it was like down the road, and they were holed up in a cave.
Oh! You're talking about when they attacked? Yes. When the rebels attacked near the pits of Hathsin, because he flies off and destroyed. Yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, the city that's up there.
Right. So, I don't know. I just feel like he would have appreciated that sort of personability that Ham brings to the table. Mm-hmm. And like I think everything's been a lesson so far. I don't know. He also didn't have really a plan for a straight up leader, right?
Yeah, right. In the letter that was kind of prior, it seemed as though Doxson was the natural inheritor of the leadership mantle, is kind of the way that it's left, and then Elend kind of stepped in the way of that.
Yeah, but he was set up as a bureaucrat, not like a leader. And maybe he was assuming that Ham would be sort of a militaristic leader of the people, as well as of the army. Kind of a commander-in-chief sort of situation. Maybe that was the idea. And I feel like he could fill that role well, given his personality. I don't think he'd survive, given what we've seen from what Elend's tried to do, but
I could totally fall into Elend's same trap, I think, to your point.
Yeah, I could totally believe that was the intention, though.
Kelsier's intention. Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that definitely tracks, because I think that with Kelsier, we really just have those like final letters to try to read and understand, and so do they, right? And so that's what a lot of this is driven off of. And I think ultimately you're right. I think that Ham would make a good leader, but good men don't always make the best leaders, which is kind of what we're learning through Elend.
Thanks, Set.
Yeah, thanks, Set. Fucking shit. That is Set's quote, isn't it? Yeah. Fuck.
That's Set's exact point.
That's almost exactly the quote. Yeah. Whoops. Pulled that out of the back of my brain. Yeah. So I mean, I really appreciate the conversation that happens here. Did you have any particular thoughts about the way that Vin's approaching the conversation? Because she's coming at it kind of...
She comes at it hot.
Hot, yeah.
But we really don't have much else in the form of Vin's like perspective to understand what she's feeling here. And it feels incomplete, and I just don't understand what her headspace is and what her motivation is, but like she seems irritable and like looking for a fight. Not a fight, but looking for turmoil a little bit. I don't know. Jumpy. She's jumpy. She's being jumpy.
Definitely jumpy.
Bad articulation. I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that she is kind of in an odd way. It feels like she has both solved her insecurity and reverted to like, because she's solved the insecurity, she's defaulting to these like very almost, I mean, you said it, so I'll say it and we can kind of understand and meet in the middle, but like aggressive actions and decisions, right? Mm-hmm. Because she has this sense of confidence, but it almost feels, and you don't want to say this because you want the best for Vin, but it almost feels unfounded. Like the degree of confidence that she has in some of her decisions and actions almost feel unfounded.
Yeah, it's, I guess, conviction.
Yeah. That's a better way of putting it than aggression. It's totally conviction. Yeah. Good call. Yeah. And that's tough to sort out. That's tough to deal with, especially with a character like Vin, of whom has had to grow through all of these different traumatic experiences and growing pains.
Right. It feels like a regression to a certain extent from like a certain amount of tact that she had displayed previously.
Yeah, totally.
But
tact is a good way of putting it, because it did feel like she was there, and now the pressure of everything is kind of turning her into a pressure cooker of those emotions.
Yeah, and is this pewter talking?
Oh, great call. Was it pewter talking before even?
Oh, I mean, that's a good question. Is she burning pewter right now?
I don't think, not to the same degree. I think that she basically dropped out of that drag at the end of the last book into going into the Well of Ascension. And I think she's been very cautious about it. I think that it was explicit last week that she'd been kind of cautious about it.
Yeah. Questions.
Yeah, that is interesting. So to end the chapter, to round it out here, after the conversation with Ellen and Ham about the army, Vin tracks down her Kolos, or Kolos friend. I like to think of them as friendly.
They're not
human.
Though.
They're not exactly friendly. Human is tough to talk to.
He hates her.
Friendly. Well, yeah, he does
explicitly.
Hate her.
He outwardly hates her.
Yeah. I think but the question is do Kolos hate everyone? Because I think they just hate humans. You know what I mean? Like, I think that
they want to be. They are humans.
Right? To put it in their verbiage. Yes, they are humans. Human, calm down, human. Can you take a step back? Can we talk about this? Don't stab me. No. Oh, God, we're never going to make a stable economy if you keep stabbing me. Like
I want a buddy cop comedy movie with Vin and Human.
Oh my God. They practically already made it, and it's called Bright.
Yeah.
It's not very good.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I got through half of it. It wasn't like I quit halfway through. It was, I had to go and I'm like, I'll watch this later, and just never had the motivation to like turn it back on. So
yeah, it's a fine movie. It's a fine movie. So anyway, we're talking about Human though, but they share this conversation about the mists, and Vin comes to some realizations. She believes the mists to truly be the enemy, and especially based on some of the things that Human says. I want to pin this into a prediction for you. So meaning I probably can't have too much of a conversation with you about these things, but I want you to ascertain, do you think that the mists are the enemy?
At this moment, yes. I think they are. And I think specifically they changed sides.
Oh.
To a certain extent. So she felt embraced by them and felt a kinship with the mist to a certain extent early on. And she like reminisces on that and like misses that feeling. And I think that stopped. I'd like to assert that stopped after, or it did. I think very explicitly it did. It stopped after Ruin was released. So Ruin was using her, and the mist, or I guess the mist, if we want to look at it that way, the mist was using her as a conduit to killing the Lord Ruler and releasing Ruin. And then now that she's actively working against Ruin, She is an enemy of the mist. That's my thought.
Okay. All right.
That's my only way of like justifying all of this.
Trying to parse that
nonsense.
out. Yeah. And I mean, it's very fun because I've been asking you kind of consistent and persistent questions about the mists, right? This entire time. And like, what do you think about the mists? What's the deepness? What's this? What's that? In kind of a fun way. And now all of a sudden the mists are maybe a bad guy. Maybe not, but maybe they are. Maybe there's, I don't know. And well, I do know, but you can't know because I know. And I think that it's been a really fun thing at the very least for me to track as you've been going through the story and see your emotions and impressions of the mist change over time, because they have shifted pretty dramatically, going from this good thing to like, whoa, that fuels her power, to like, now they're killing people like randomly kind of. And then we kind of have a math
shying away from her.
Yeah.
Like she's now repelling it in general, and it dissipates when she uses allomancy.
Yeah,
that's not cool.
It's fascinating, is what it is. So,
that's
true. I'm excited to delve in more here, which is why I'm glad we got to talk about that for a second. Cool. All right. Anything else in this chapter? That's pretty much it. It's also the only time that we spend with Vin. One of the fascinating things about this book, to me, is that this is no longer Vin's story in its own way. Like, Vin is still a big part of the story, but we have fully moved away from this being the tale of Vin. This now being the tale of...
She matters less.
The crew.
She doesn't have to be the knife anymore.
Well, I think she's more explicitly the knife now. She's not the only knife.
No, but Ellen
both
can
knives.
be too.
Yeah, right. They're both knives. Because that's what they say at the
that
end
makes her less special.
I don't disagree. I would add that I think that it's partially because a lot of her problems, her issues resolved in the end of the last story. She feels confident in a lot of things. So where we were kind of picking in the first episode of the show at like Ellen's character suddenly appearing and changing, we have Vin's having mostly resolved, I think, well, and I'm not saying completely or entirely or anything like that. There can be developments and there will be, but we have Ellen's character who had off-screen development, but Vin's feels kind of coming into the story like a mostly complete pie that maybe just needs some sugar on top and then to be like toasted, you know? It was a shitty metaphor, but do you understand what I mean? Like just a final
I get what
touch.
you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Her headspace isn't fucked up anymore. Like she has physical threats that she has to deal with, but she's not dealing with it alone. And I feel like there's a lot more complicated things to deal with from other people's perspectives. And Vin can just kind of be the utility. Like what are we get other than the idea that she has a kinship and connection to Ruin because she released him. Like that's the only thing that like strikes me as something that is strictly unique to her at this point. So I get it. I love Vin, and I don't want her perspective to go away, but I totally understand that based on how the story's progressed, she's grown out of the story to a certain extent.
Yeah. Yeah. I think she's now, as opposed to becoming an action figure that you want to articulate in all these different ways and move their arms, she's become more of a chess piece in terms of the overall story. And it's a lot easier to just move a chess piece as opposed to articulate the chess piece, which is why I think we get this focus.
I'm just going to follow through with
Run
it.
with the
She's
metaphor.
a queen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, realistically, yeah, totally.
Any distance, any direction.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying that it's not like we're done with Vin. We've got a lot more to go with Vin. The story is nowhere near over. But at the same time, I'm not exactly missing Vin because it feels right. She feels right, even in these moments, kind of.
Yeah. Even in the turmoil that she's facing, it's not internal turmoil.
Yeah.
So much. There's still Reen a little bit that like we gotta exercise that demon somehow, but
true. Yeah. I'm glad we got to talk about that because again, you know, we don't get to go back really to Vin for the rest of the week. We go back to Ellen again, but
yeah.
Cool. With that, we go to chapter 16. We kick it off with a logbook entry here, and it's a long one. So bear with me, folks. They're called allomantic savants, men or women who flare their metal so long and so hard that the constant influx of allomantic power transforms their very physiology. In most cases, with most metals, the effects of this are very slight. Bronze burners, for instance, often become bronze savants without knowing it. Their range is expanded from burning the metal so long. Becoming a pewter savant is dangerous as it requires pushing the body so hard in a state where one cannot feel exhaustion or pain. Most people accidentally kill themselves before the process is complete, and in my opinion, the benefit isn't worth the effect. Tin savants, however, now they are something special. Endowed with senses beyond what any normal allomancer would need or even want, they become slaves to what they touch, hear, see, smell, and taste. Yet the abnormal power of their senses gives them a distinct and interesting advantage. One could argue that, like an inquisitor who has been transformed by a hemalurgic spike, the allomantic savant is no longer even human.
The one I want to focus on, I very clearly and very obviously, this is about Spook.
Can I make mention of something before we go too far into this?
Yep.
The fact that bronze burners are still basically worthless, even when they're savants, is fucking hilarious to me. like they get nothing.
Most of them probably don't know that they're allomancers.
Yeah.
And then once they become the most adept of their field, they don't even fucking know that.
Bronze gets the short end of the stick, man. Okay, anyway, I just wanted to say that before we go.
No, that's totally true.
Yeah.
Fucking bronzies.
Fucking bronzies.
Just wanted a little crossover there. Sorry. What I want to know, specifically because of Vin, is what the trade-off is as a as a pewter savant. Because it says that most people would die to get there, and the risk isn't necessarily worth the reward, but it doesn't describe what the reward is in that respect. It just says that most people would die and it maybe isn't worth it. But clearly she's been burning pewter for almost as long as Spook's been burning tin. At a certain, it was months. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It was
I think
the entirety of the last
year.
book?
Yeah, pretty much. With a couple of exceptions when she was knocked out. But even then, pretty sure that didn't end like the text says with Spook. Like he subconsciously burns when he's asleep, just like she does.
Have to in order to recover. That's how she recovered and didn't die. Was burning pewter,
right,
unconsciously. So I want to know what that effect was for her if she did indeed become a pewter savant. And
I would question whether or not she became a savant or was just starting to feel the onset of the effects. You know what I mean?
I mean, I don't know what you're talking about to make that distinction.
The onset of the negative effects, she was basically pushed to the brink of death, and I don't think she made it to savantism, if that makes sense.
Okay.
She didn't cross the threshold, I think, based on what we have so far.
All right. I think we don't have enough information to make that call.
Yeah.
I wouldn't feel comfortable making that call based on what we know so far.
Right. I totally agree.
Anyway, I'm curious to see what that is because it's the only one that's really left out of what the actual difference is. So anyway.
Yeah. I think that this section, again, does a good job of defining things that you were kind of questioning before, right? So this is where there is this question of what makes it different? Well, why can pewter arms pewter drag and why don't? This is a big thing that got you, I remember, for a week in the last book is why can pewter arms pewter drag? Why don't other things similarly drag? What happens if they go for longer? And this is that answer of savantism begins to develop in various forms. What are the long-term effects?
That's not quite the case, though. If a pewter drag, a pewter hangover, is the result of a pewter drag, but they're not a pewter savant, that's not the same thing.
No, but the question was the long-term effects of the other metals if you burn them continuously.
Oh, okay.
That was your thing. It wasn't necessarily. You said that this is this for pewter. What is this for tin? What is this for iron steel?
Yeah.
Why just pewter? And so this is that kind of equivocation across here's where that starts to happen. There's probably a term for the enhancing of senses that Spook experienced to get him to this point that we don't necessarily see that transition or that experience, but.
And I guess maybe instead of a hangover-like symptom, if you go an extended period, not to the point of savantism, but is that the proper term? Savantism?
I think that's what the text says.
Okay. I wasn't sure.
But
just an extended period of tin burning, not to like the very extreme, but to the point where like you were burning it for a long time and then you drop it. It's probably like comparably really, really dull senses for a little while. Like we see with Spook later in this chapter or in this section.
Right.
So,
yeah, I would definitely agree. I feel like that definitely lines up with the theory.
I could see that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Similar deprivation because the, neurons in the brain are firing in that extrasensory direction for so long. You think about it like dopamine addiction. Yeah, right. Like that's the way that my brain thinks about it is like if you're shortening that dopamine rush and you need to have that drug or exposure in order to get back there after years and years of repairing, you can sometimes fix things. I kind of think about it the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Like a strangely addictive quality, especially with tin.
Like staring into a bright light and then trying to see at night. It'll recover.
But yeah, staring at the sun and then trying to do literally anything. Yeah, totally. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is our longest chapter of the week. So getting into it here, we've got a lot here with Spook. So Spook wakes up sleeping under very precarious position as he burns tin instinctively like a computer arm, as we were mentioning. And he's working hard to make his newfound abilities and handicaps work for him. These extrasensory components. This is where we get the glasses really described as these clear lenses that are really just there to hold the things off of him so that he has enough distance for his eyes to catch reflections, to be able to interpret light and what he's seeing. It's fascinating. This section, I think, is, again, another like masterclass idea and portrayal from Sanderson. But starting out with Spook here, what'd you think?
I mean, I just love the imagery of him waking up and just grabbing a fistful of like tin flakes and throwing them into a coffee mug and slugging it down. Like, there's so much fucking metal.
It's so metal.
And I mean, anytime, like, none of them ever described the amount of metal that they're ingesting as a fistful. So
yeah,
this is his full day plus full night of like persistent burn, and then another handful just in case.
I'm thinking about this from, kind of in the way that we've discussed this series at large, is that this is broken up into eras, right? So we've talked about this being kind of broken up into different eras and the 4 planned eras. I can almost imagine a timeline in the Mistborn universe in which someone wakes up in their like 1980s-esque home and like an advertisement rolls and they're like, are you tired of waking up feeling the dull ache of missing senses and like grabbing like just a scoop full of tin and like throwing it in and like just this advertisement that is basically what Spook is going through.
I mean, that's BioShock
it's
Infinite's.
Like coffee. Yeah, good call. Salts.
Yeah.
But I can just very cleanly imagine this translating to like a coffee brand advertisement for like tin the metal for some people. Like I can just see that very plainly.
Sipping on tin and juice.
Tin and juice is going to be a new cocktail name. Don't you worry about it. So we kind of jump here from the waking up and we're introduced to Dern, who is a bit of a proponent of the utopian appearance, quote, of Urteau. Urteau. I've said it right every time. And now I've hit a point where I said it wrong once. And now my brain is not going to say it right for a bit. Urteau. It's Urteau. It's got to be Urteau. So Urteau, this city that they're in. And I find Dern's character very interesting and fascinating in the fact that he kind of supports this. We see this system start to be constructed around like the approved colors and sort of this general tyranny that is imposed by the citizen make for a very interesting society post Kelsier. And the fact that like Dern Ska is also kind of a proponent for it adds a good conversation about equity right now in society.
Yeah, Dern for me is kind of hard to nail down because, like you said, he kind of simultaneously seems to be this proponent of the system and to what Kelsier preached based on what he's heard. And like he's the chief of a thieving crew, and like that makes a little bit of sense. But he also points out the flaws and issues and is critical at times and understands, I don't know, what's going on to a certain extent. So I don't know if we can really trust him in any real way. So I'm cautious to put much faith in Dern.
Yeah, and I don't think we're necessarily meant to put faith in Dern so much as he is a lens to maybe view the one perspective of the populace's opinion about what's going on in Urteau. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think he's an end all be all. I feel like he fits a very specific need, which is to say, some people agree with this, some people don't. And here's kind of the vibe. Is this better than chaos? Is this better than what we were experiencing before? And he's kind of a lens to view that through, which I find a really interesting and attractive lens. I think that in my first pass through the series, I really didn't pay attention to him that much. But I think if we think about kind of the larger picture of what this is saying, especially if we think about Dockson's character in the previous book, I think that it paints, and even Kelsier's in the first book, I think it paints a very interesting lens through which we can imagine the original crew who never went through what they went through thinking about a society post-Lord Ruler. Like if they didn't have the experience of what they went through, you could imagine any one of them kind of talking or thinking this way. Speaking of the Citizen and sort of the vibe of the tyrannical environment in general that we find ourselves in, the Citizen has legally approved wearing a new color red today, which was previously not legal, which I find the most, I've already said it once in this episode, but superfluous of things for a leader to be approving is a fucking color of clothing. And he keeps his sad looking sister on his sad leash right next to her. Not actually on a leash, but it feels like she's just attached at the hip. And the Citizen loads these noblemen of whom are decried as criminals into the houses and burns the house down with them inside screaming. Except, as we find out over the course of conversation, these aren't noblemen anymore. We've long since ran out of the pure-blooded noblemen, pure-blooded in quotes, because they may have even been bastardized somewhere along the line. They're Ska that have noble blood. And it's just, it grabs my heart and it like wrenches it and squeezes it a little bit as we think about the way, in addition, that Kelsier's words and intentions have been weaponized for this mass killing of innocent people in this moment. And it's really kind of devastating to the ideology in its own way to see it weaponized. When you think about Demue's belief, not necessarily what Kelsier himself stood for, even you can Kelsier would not have agreed necessarily with this happening, and neither would the Church of the Survivor, but how do either of them stand as good role models when some people do this with it? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it's a wacky, wild fantasy novel where the words of religious figures are manipulated and twisted for personal gain and justification of hatred. Like, wouldn't that suck if that actually happened in this world, Crossland? Every fucking time?
I can't believe you turned my words on me. You're right. I think that's kind of exactly what Sanderson's getting at to some degree.
Like, which I think is really going to happen. I think what's really ironic here is a lot of the justification, at least what we see later on, is like allomancy. The existence of allomancy necessarily, in their eyes, means noble blood. And the survivor that they worship was a Mistborn.
the utter hypocrisy of everything is in this episode, rather in this little chunk, this chunk of story out of Urteau is so brilliantly rendered by Sanderson as a perfect metaphor for the way that religion is manipulated to the ends and the means of those of whom are able to control and puppet the strings.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Truly brilliantly done. And honestly, I don't think from my experience online, I don't think this gets talked about enough in terms of the citizen and the way that he really impacts things and the impressions and sort of the utilization there. I think a lot of people focus on how cool Spook is in this section, which I agree.
Well, there's
Spook
that.
is very cool.
Like, this is mostly what I was thinking of was the religious sort of commentary that comes along with it.
And that's, I think, what makes these novels so hard to like pin into a category too, because I'm not besmirching anyone of whom thinks this way, for the record, but these novels go like back and forth between like YA and adult fiction. And this is the moment when it's like adult fiction. But if you just pay attention to Spook, it's kind of YA. You know what I mean? Like, it's depending on how far you peel back the onion for yourself, depending on how far you look into the window pane, as Brandon describes himself as writing, you get more or less out of it. And
also to push back on you a little bit, you yourself have kind of had difficulty really nailing down the actual real difference between those genres.
It's mostly marketing, but yeah, right. Yeah. But I think that that's also why this book is so hard to place, and why I think it could be a good book for a teenager to read, and it can also be a fun book for adults to read. I mean, like, it hits both categories, versus there are some books that are very clearly written for people middle grade because of the language that's used, the kind of obviousness of the themes or plot sometimes, which can be still fun reads. Percy Jackson is a very fun series, but it's also very top level with the thoughts and what's going on. Still epic in its own right, but not the same. To use a recent example that's been brought up inside of the Discord because of the TV show. So yeah, I don't know. I really appreciate Urteau, the citizen, and sort of the utter hypocrisy. Reminds me so much of the mid 2000s Catholic Church under John Paul the something or other, of which just felt like the most hypocritical organization during my lifetime, religious wise, but also feels like at the same time you've got vibes of Righteous Gemstones tucked in all over here. So I think that power is often manipulated by those that have power to benefit themselves, and Quellion is doing exactly that. Kelsier preached against it, but it's hard to say if he would do it himself. I missed what you said. What did you say?
Jared Leto.
Oh, Jared fucking. And it's hard to pin it any other direction. So I think you can totally understand where this comes from inside of Brandon's writing, especially if you think about the time frame with the Iraq war kind of going on in the backdrop of a lot of this, and kind of the idea that one person is this. And I want to clarify, I'm not pinning this entirely on Brandon's state of mind, but it was very hard to avoid that state of mind in a lot of writing around the time. It was very pervasive in American culture. And so it feels like he is kind of in his own way talking down about George W. Bush's presidency with the sort of way that he consolidated powers. And as long as he did it, it was okay. And as long as he wrote a rule that said that it could do this, it was an acceptable thing. To me, this parallels like the Patriot Act in a way, or the powers acquired via the Patriot Act.
I could see that. Totally. When was this published?
2008 or 9.
Yeah, 2008. So, right.
But keep in mind, he wrote these all together, and the first book came out in 7, which means he probably wrote them in 4.
4 to 6, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
That was
fair.
my thought. I
Totally
think it's
fair.
very, I'm not saying it's reactionary, but I do think that it, at the very least, has ties to that in this moment.
I feel like there's too much nuance in general in Branderson's writing to be able to pin one thing on one real world event, but I could totally see that being an influence.
Yeah, I would agree. Cool. All right. I think we covered our thoughts on everything except for the mass killing, I guess. It feels about the move of killing all these people and sort of even the comparisons to the Lord Ruler in its own way in that moment. The hypocrisy there.
Yeah.
Like burning the house down with these people inside.
Yeah. Yeah. We get those execution scenes from the Lord Ruler that are really fucking brutal, but they work.
Yep.
But then again, he's like railing against it in the same breath. Like,
yeah,
I don't it's same shit, you know?
Yeah, that's fair. I just wanted to make sure that we addressed it because I don't feel like we talked about that, but we talked more about the whole power structure, more or less, which enables him to pull off those kind of things. So, I really appreciate the way that Spook speaks about Kelsier in this week's reading. I think is really, really interesting as we analyze it. Spook is at this point around 17. And where Vin's been able to kind of outgrow Kelsier, Spook thinks of him as this idol, this thing to live up to still. It's such a chewy bit to like think about, especially as we progress into what happens later in this week's chapter. Or in this week's reading. Yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of there's a lot there.
I mean, of course he thinks of him as an idol, though. Like, what situation would change that for him? Vin has been in this situation where she's been able to accomplish more than Kelsier did and become a more well-rounded leader in terms of perspective because she's had Elend around and she's seen so much more and she's overcome the position that Kelsier was in. Whereas on the other hand, Spook, he's not been that strong or versatile or useful as Vin has been by his own merit, by his own account and by just kind of the facts of the situation. He's not a Mistborn. And like maybe that changes going forward with his tin savantism and now soon his like pewter usage. Like ignoring that going forward, but like up until now, what has there been to allow him to abandon the ideas of Kelsier and like drop the idea that he's the Messiah that he's been like worshiping since before he died?
That's a great point. I think to me, I read it more as like 17-year-old idealism, if that makes sense. Like this is what he believes an ideal person could be and like looked up to him because of how important he was to him in the moment and like pulling him out and giving him a nickname and like making him this big deal. And then Kelsier was a big public deal. So it's like my friend became a celebrity and I looked up to him because I was a little teenage boy and then he died and there's this whole thing. But I do totally understand the perspective of outgrowing, feeling like his usefulness has been outgrown, I should say, not outgrowing his usefulness, but he feels, like I said at the beginning here, he feels worthless in a lot of ways. Yeah. And so he's kind of coming to terms with feeling like he's got the lowest power on the Allomantic totem pole.
The crew outgrew him.
Yeah. That's a better way of putting it. Yeah. It stinks for him.
Yeah, it sucks.
Yeah. And so as a 17-year-old, you can very easily imagine how he stays in that trap, of cult of personality to some degree at that point.
Right.
Yeah. Because Vin was stuck in that trap too for a very long time. I mean,
yeah. And she had the tools to get out of it. And he doesn't.
Yeah. Tools to get out of it, meaning the ability to like, magical capability to feel like she can be more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, right. obviously he has the mental capabilities of getting out of that trap, but why? What's the motivation?
Yeah, true. Fair point. Because it seems like a good thing. It seems like it helped more than it hurt. So makes sense.
Yeah.
So Spook confronts Beldra and inside of this crowd, in this riot in the moment, and he's able to see her green eyes through the mask he wears. Is it kind of a truly profound revelation of the power within a tin savant. The conversation they share, hands embrace, the warning shot he fires by telling her, kind of what's going on with him. Oh man, it sets up this like fun bit of story between, I don't want to, you don't want to call them star-crossed lovers or anything like that, because that's not it at all. He's pining again. And we love you, Spook, but dear God, what'd you think? What'd you make?
I mean, it sets up a fucking story. No doubt. Yeah. I don't know. She isn't like repulsed by him or like isn't like, I don't know what to make of that. She's not, it makes me think that she's not totally on her brother's side and he's like completely misreading the situation. So that's a positive. But pretty quickly, Citizen notices in a very like outright way. We know he's a coin shot from later on in the fight, but is he also a tin eye? And therefore, is he a Mistborn?
That does ask an interesting question.
Yeah, because he's very like he is
perceptive,
laser focused on Spook like that. So, I mean, maybe he's just paranoid about his sister's positioning. There could be that, and like he's just constantly looking at her. But maybe he's a Mistborn, and that's a dangerous prospect to deal with. Because if that's the case, maybe he's found the cache.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe he has. Another question here is if he, if there was a seeker among any of the noblemen, they could out him. You know what I mean? Like he could be outed if anyone had secret capabilities, if he had ever burned metal publicly as well.
There's that, but I mean, who are you going to tell?
You might shout it in the crowd. Yeah, and then you get executed. Right. Fair point. You got me. You got me. I do want to bring up, too, I think it's interesting. I don't think Beldra talks until she talks to Spook. Like, she's in the room with Quellion a couple of times, but I don't think she ever says anything. And it kind of adds to that forlorn loneliness that we were kind of highlighting from Spook's perspective.
But he's also just been watching her from a distance.
Right.
And like, it's never been during
but a distance
meeting.
Is pretty close for him.
It is, but
yeah. I
feel like he's only ever seen them separated, though. Or he's only described them separated. Because when Quellion starts talking, she goes out back. So, I don't know. Yeah.
I guess my point was just that Beldra doesn't really talk until she talks to Spook, right? That's really kind of the first and only. She has this kind of, I said forlorn, that's from Spook's perspective. She's got this sort of melancholy about her.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, of course, we find this confrontation and kind of the question about the Almantic capabilities. And we see Spook fighting for his life against the Citizen's Men. It's a very different combat than all of the other Mistborn fighting that we've really seen up until this point. I mean, Sazed has some interesting bits, and we see dueling canes from other perspective, but we don't really get this like hand-to-hand level combat until this moment. And like I said earlier, if you know anything about me, this is where Daredevil feels the strongest. I mean, the tie over the eyes vibes, totally, definitely early Daredevil, pull the cap over. He can't see anyway, hide his face, whatever. Totally get it. Love that. This is when it really comes home for me, where it's the almost predictive element of senses, because he can literally read impressions based on the way that people are changing the way that they're standing.
Right.
Yeah. Super cool.
Yeah. And Quellion's coin shot, and he's got two pewter thugs, like.
Right. Yeah.
With him, like this, it's a fucking brutal situation that our poor boy's gotten himself into.
For a tin eye. Yeah.
Yeah. And he got super close to getting away.
Yeah.
He got super close. And I feel like he would have had he known that they were thugs. He would have been more careful about it. And he would have like stepped around and stepped out of the reach of the guy that was on the ground that eventually grabbed him by the ankle. Like,
I mean, there's an argument that if he knew that there were thugs, he might not have put himself in that situation to begin with. He probably wouldn't have been so bold with Beldra if he knew that the threat was so valid.
I think he would have been.
You think he would have still? Okay.
I don't think he thought he was risking anything by approaching her like that. I think he thought he was completely safe. Because he was scrambling to think of exits after the fact.
That's true. Wait, you're saying you don't think he would have approached if...
No, I don't think in this situation that he like went up to, he didn't have an exit strategy planned in case they caught him or in case they noticed.
Yeah.
Which tells me that even if he knew...
You're saying that this is more impulse. This is more spur of the moment.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah, I can get that. I can definitely get that. It's got this... The whole fight feels... Spook feels like he's holding his own, especially against two pewter arms when you figured that out in the end. Like these are tougher, buffer, swifter people.
So that's something I want to ask.
Yeah.
That seems like a brand new term. Pewter arm? Instead of thug.
No, it's all the way back in the first book.
Is it?
Yep.
I
It's
feel like it was
also been in the
mostly
back of
referred
every
to as
book.
thug.
Thug is a term used, yeah. So is pewter arm.
Okay. That's fair.
It's probably the only one with two names. You know, if I do imagine a reason why, I'm just thinking about this right now, I would bet that thug is the term used within thieving crews, and that pewter arm is probably the technical term, or a more technical term.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I think that a lot of the other ones fit regardless of, you know.
It's like enforcer and goon on a hockey team.
Good call. Very, very kind of subtle delineations, but they filled the same role. Fair point. I do want to bring up here when we're talking about this fight, of course, the end of the fight, right? Which is that one of the pewter arms stabs through one of the other ones to get Spook and to get at Spook. It seems as though the sword breaks off or like snaps in him, and he blacks out and is then caught as his adrenaline wears off.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I don't know. Adrenaline wears off. Pewter wears off. I don't know. I'm making connections that I know are there but don't mean anything. I'm trying to make them mean more. But it's whatever. I think it just is exactly what it is on the page.
Yeah. That's totally fair. I just love the way that this chapter ends with that moment. This combat feels really clean and smooth.
It does.
Then the boldness of stabbing through one of your own people just to make sure that the other guy doesn't get away.
I mean, yeah, that's a move.
that's a you must have really not fucking like that guy, right? Like, I'm okay with getting you so long as I get him. Fair enough. All right. With that, we move into chapter 17. The logbook. The subtlety displayed in the ash-eating microbes and enhanced plants showed that Rashik got better and better at using the power. It burned out in a matter of minutes, but to a god, minutes can pass like hours. During that time, Rashik began as an ignorant child who shoved a planet too close to the sun, grew into an adult who could create ash mounts to cool the air, then finally became a mature artisan who could develop plants and creatures for specific purposes. It also shows his mindset during his time with Preservation's power. Under its influence, he was obviously in a protective mode. Instead of leveling the ash mounts and trying to push the planet back into place, he was reactive, working furiously to fix problems that he himself had caused.
So this is absolutely amazing detail, but is also written in a way that I forget that this is a logbook and not just a straight up lore dump. You know? Like, this person that's writing this book is the hero of ages and went through a similar experience of like power. Is that how they know? Like they're just given the information of the previous moves made? Or like where do they get this information? Is it written somewhere by Rashik? I don't know. It's a mystery to me.
Those are interesting assumptions, you know, based on what we're given here. And I think it is important to remember that these aren't just because they're contextualized in the form of the logbook that we're reading here. But at the same time, they do have that element of lore dumpiness, but it doesn't feel heavy-handed, which I think is kind of a tough thing to balance here.
Because it's technically outside of the story.
Yeah.
Or at least that's the way it is presented as a sort of annotation or addendum.
Right. I do want to bring your attention to one bit here. It's the fact that it also shows his mindset during his time with Preservation's power. So this specifically outlines the fact of the power that he picked up as Preservation's. What thoughts did you have around that?
I think there's two wells.
Okay.
And I think that the reason why there's like this future that we're like learning about and talking about within this logbook, looking backwards, is because the hero of ages is whoever picks up and like grabs the power from Preservation's well, not from Ruin's. And Creedic Shaw was built upon Ruin's well as a prison, not as a hiding place. Or maybe both, but for containment, not for just strictly hiding it.
Yeah. Okay.
That's where my mind goes with that. I know it's kind of off the wall from just that descriptor, but it makes sense to me. And maybe that's in the pits of Hatsin. And that's why the Terrace people have congregated around it. And maybe that's why the Atium comes from there.
Cool. So we're greeted in this chapter by Elend having made the decision for his army to fight the enemy. Of course, that enemy is the silent killer, the mists that he has so long managed to avoid with his army. It's great to see that, he offers them a way out. And so some head back to Luthadel, very few, according to the text, but that the men choose to stand with him, suiting up as though they're about to march into the battle for their lives, because that's exactly what is about to happen. I think that speaks to Elend's ability to manifest himself as a leader in this time, which I think is a really important thing to recognize. We've referred to him as a tyrant and aggressive and negative and bad in the very first episode of the show, and we've kind of talked about the way that this has all felt kind of like a slippery slope from his ideology. But people follow him.
Yeah, for sure. I think the fact that the soldiers were given an out and allowed to leave, presumably without consequence, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, without consequence.
Makes so much sense from Elend. And beyond that, I feel like that would be a way for Ham to be more on board with their decision-making.
Yeah, right.
And what has to happen. Like, giving them that out makes perfect sense.
Totally. And it's a nice blend of the earlier chapter 15, I think, wherein they're arguing about it. This feels like the solution to that argument, that feels like meeting in the middle of the road as opposed to an absolute answer either way.
Right. Yeah, it's as much of a compromise as you can kind of come to with this decision.
Yeah, as much as you could possibly manage. I definitely agree. What do you think about Elend and Demue's conversation about the Emperor's kind of faith and its sincerity? What do you make of the conversation that of not only Kelsier's snap, but of his true full change from before to after his experience in the pits as well? Like there's a big conversation. Most of this chapter is taken up by this conversation, kind of about faith and belief and the dichotomy therein, and then also Kelsier and the origin of faith. What do you think about it?
It's a lot of new information that we have to take on face value, truly, but makes sense from what we know about Kelsier and like the process he underwent. But we know that not in a firsthand account,
Right.
So pairing all of this information that Demue gives with what we get from Spook, if Spook is to be believed, like if his understanding of what happens later on is reliable, that Kelsier's like spirit is giving him direction and power, which he gets the power from something, but whether or not it's Kelsier is up in the air, truly. It really makes me curious what actually happened down in the pits. And also gives me more fuel for the theory that there is another well down there. And if there's another well down there, maybe there's another little nugget down there. And Kelsier found a little nuggie. And Kelsier started munching on some chicken nugs when he should have been looking for Atium and became a Mistborn.
So, wait, I just want you to clarify. You're suggesting that there is another well where?
At the pits.
So you think it's in the pits. Okay, you didn't say that before explicitly, so.
Yeah, I did. I said that's why the Terrace people congregated there, and that's why the Atium was found there specifically. I mentioned that it was at the pits. Yeah.
I brain skipped over that. Okay. All right. Well, all right. Cool. Yep.
Cool. Yep. Kelsier found a chicken nugget.
That's a solid prediction. I'm going to find a way to just turn that into a prediction because it did not feel as explicit.
That's what I thought you were writing down.
Oh, no. I did understand what you were suggesting about a second pool that was of Ruin's power, like of a second well. But it didn't feel like you were so explicit as to suggest that it was the pits of Hatsin.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So your you're adding on this additional context from Demu and the change that he experienced, saying that he maybe ate a different nugget that made him.
Yep.
I just needed to clarify.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't know that we talked about the bravery of the men, of course, and we've talked about a lot of things, but this chapter ends with Ellen kind of shouting to the men as they begin to fall, as 15% of them roughly begin to fall, about staying strong, and that we can nurse a lot of these people back to health, and that some will survive, and to just like basically tend to your fellow man as you can. And then Demu falls down right next to him. Man, is that a shocking way to end this chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. So that raises some questions for me. I guess it's really, they assumed Demu was already inoculated, and that's a tragic oversight. Or he was, and they're wrong about the fact that being out there inoculates you. Like, those are the two options here. He's been out in the mist before. Vin has seen him out in the mist before, but that was before.
That was before they turned hostile, really, at the rate that they're hostile.
Right. So why are those people not inoculated? If it was, yes, not as potent, but still, is it at 100% potency right now, or is it still growing? And if it's still growing, are the people that were unaffected now going to be affected? Like, what are the rules?
PJ, when you don't know something, you can't just default to what are the rules. You should try to make an assumption to try to make it make sense in your head.
I think what the easiest answer is that he wasn't actually inoculated, and he was kind of hiding that, or wasn't straight up saying that he wasn't yet.
Sure.
I don't think it's necessarily deception, but maybe just didn't think to say it.
Yeah.
That's the easiest answer and makes the most sense. So
he's not intentionally malicious. He just maybe didn't even realize.
Right.
And thought that he was okay, protected by the survivor. He's kind of, in a strange way, Demu is kind of the survivor's chosen one that isn't Vin. Like he's kind of a secondary.
He's the Pope.
What? Did you call him a Pope? I think he's more like an apostle.
No, the crew's the apostles.
I think Demu is a tangential apostle. He's Peter. He was around. He was there. He wrote the book, and so he included himself. Like he was.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, dear old Demu succumbs to the mists. Do you think he dies?
No.
This is a prediction for sure. Okay. No.
I think he survives, and then he maybe goes a little unhinged.
Ooh.
I think he becomes much in the same way the citizen is misinterpreting the words of the survivor.
Oh,
he becomes like a miracle of the survivor and starts preaching that way.
Because he's already treading that line a little bit. Like he's a lot more, I would argue, wholesome, but that does make it interestingly tangible. Okay. All right. I can see that.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. With that, we get into chapter 18. So we've got a logbook here. Rashik didn't solve all the world's problems. In fact, with each thing he did fix, he created new issues. However, he was clever enough that each subsequent problem was smaller than the ones before it. So instead of plants that died from the distorted sun and ashy ground, we got plants that didn't provide enough nutrition. He did save the world. True, the near destruction was his fault in the first place, but he did an admirable job, all things considered. At least he didn't release ruin to the world as we did.
So ultimately, these are the same thoughts that I had in the previous logbook. Easy to forget that this is a logbook entry and not just a lore dump. But I am, as always, amazed by the depth of everything that's being shared here.
I love that final line, the admonition of he did better than we did.
I mean,
Yeah, exactly. There's a weird shoulder shrug moment here. Sazed in chapter 18 talking about this. Sazed sending off the final horse feels very ominous in kind of a grandiose metaphorical way that I think Brandon Sanderson doesn't often do. And he even is almost so oblique in this moment to say that Sazed thinks that it's a metaphor, which feels it tickles me in a weird way that I don't know if I love, but I do want to ask what you make of the metaphor of this horse being sent off and this beast, this final horse.
So what specifically are you referring to? I'll give my sort of thought. Specifically the fact that this is a white horse that is ash stained and malnourished, and its ribs are showing it's unable to carry the weight of what it's meant to bear. And it seems like an appropriate symbolism for Elend, but I don't know for sure that's what you're going for.
You know, that's an interesting comparison to bring it to Elend. I'm not necessarily saying that there's a right answer here, just to be clear. I just want to clarify that I think that there is a metaphor here, and what's crazy to me is that Brandon doesn't explain it. And in the window pane way, it feels like it's not fully, it's baked. The idea is baked. I don't know specifically what he's shooting for. That's why I kind of asked what you saw in the window pane, if that makes sense. For me, I love the analogy of Elend. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's this regal beast that's been starved to a point of desperation and to a point of where it's almost no longer useful, which is to say, I think this being the final beast of burden that they have shows that the burden is now on them to make the change in the world. Like that's the way that my brain goes, especially as we look to the way that the humans have to lift the cart and carry the cart that Alrianne and Breeze are in, which is not unheard of, unbecoming, anything like that, but it feels almost like a twist too far of the opulent knife for Breeze. For Alrianne, it feels on character, but for Breeze, it feels like a little bit too much.
It does. Totally.
But that's neither here nor there inside of the metaphor.
The only way it would make sense is if that carriage was also carrying supplies. Like if it wasn't
I'm imagining
strictly...
it's a convenient way, yeah. They stripped out a bunch of like bad weight, they said. Like a lot of the rear was like wasted weight. But I would imagine it's also carrying supplies. Otherwise, it would be obtuse, I think, to put them in that position.
Right.
Yeah.
But still too much for Sazed to go along with it and jump in the
consciously
carriage.
make the decision to do it himself. Yeah. Right.
Exactly. So regardless, there's symbolism there. There's like Sazed explicitly mentions it, as you've said. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they're condemning this horse to either a very difficult life of
end of life. Yeah.
Well, I mean, he says it'll be hard, but it could survive. Yeah. So it'll be either a death or a very difficult life filled with starvation, essentially. Why not eat the fucking horse? Like, they don't even address that as an option here. Mm-hmm. And that feels like a very normal thing for warbands to do when their horses become less than useful and they're dealing with like starvation on their own front, is eat the horse.
So I don't disagree with you, actually. I think that is a very reasonable call. I think the answer here lies in the overall tone of the story itself, I think, where it's like characters in this world probably wouldn't do that based on the logic of the world. My argument myself, though, like that's Brandon's argument, is like, we've never gone that far. They wouldn't go that far, if that makes sense. So like that would be a tonal shift. The story hasn't been to that level of desperation. Like,
it doesn't have to be desperation to realize that it's utility.
I agree with you. For me, the source of this comes more from the fact that it was so scrawny that it was unlikely to really provide sustenance, and so they like.
If it's able to walk, it has muscles,
and also they'd be slowing down to kill it, slaughter it. Like, yeah,
put it on the cart.
That's actually a more reasonable. That's the most reasonable solution, is to put it on the cart and then whenever next you stop, fully slaughter it. But yeah, I don't disagree with you. I just feel like it is
or just lead it, like, let it walk with you. Don't ride it, but just walk it. I didn't like that was left on the table without even being addressed.
I definitely agree with you. I don't like it. It just feels weird. It's not even that I don't like it. It just feels weird. It doesn't feel right for any number of reasons to me. So yeah, can't help but agree. So it's a weird note. Anyway, so obviously Sazed is our lead sad boy in the story so far, and as he marches along in the snow, he's got this snow ash, rather. I said snow, but it's ash. As he's like marching through these piles of ash and whatnot, he reflects on the value of religion, especially in times like these where the world is stepping all over you. Within that, he contemplates divinity and how it should protect and prevent slaughter and be perfect, and it should be perfectly reconcilable with everything that's going on in the world. Within, this sort of absolutism, I think, is really hard to pierce in its own way, because religion isn't supposed to be a perfect shield, and Sazed hasn't come to realize that due to the tribulations he's faced. He's flipped his idea of like it not needing to be perfect, which was the intent and kind of the way that he began to now there can only be one correct solution because something has to be correct. And that's a hard thing to face.
This is such a weird situation that he's put himself in, though. Like, he is the scholar first and religious expert as a result of his scholarship. And like, I think he's not only having a hard time with the idea of accepting imperfection, but he's also unable to consider it as like a fine and frankly necessary concession, you know? Like,
yeah.
Then you add in the spite. Like, he is crossing off a lot of these just basically out of spite. He's looking for a reason to cross these off his list. And like, maybe it's the idea that he can chase vindication and validation internally by striking these religions down. That seems to be the vibe that I'm getting from him. And he's not actually getting any of those like positive feelings, but he just is still trying. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that he's digging his own grave at the same time as he's going kind of like, woe is me for my digging. It's so hard to lift this shovel. You know what I mean? Like it's not like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy necessarily, but it does have that element of before you knew enough to acknowledge this as kind of truth and fact, and now you've separated yourself because you've been broken by events. And that's the character struggle in this moment is I've lost that because of the events that have kind of shaken me to my core. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the other folly that he's run into, that he's wrestling with, that he hasn't addressed yet, is that it's a very real possibility that nobody's found the exact correct combination of answers. There very well could be a religion in there that got a lot of things right. And then if there's one thing wrong, he's like, nope, fuck it. But like, this is a jigsaw puzzle.
True. It's not one of those children's toys where you put the blocks in the hole, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Jigsaw puzzle is a good way to put it.
So
yeah. There's no definite answer, especially when we are simultaneously confronted with inside of this book, the idea that there was a religion, maybe the Conjure religion, something at the very least, they're aware of rune and preservation. So those seem like naturally the correct religions. Yeah, and there's this weird like dichotomy, and that's not to say it's religion, it's just an elemental force that's going on in the world. But there's so many like, what's right? Kind of, I don't know. To imagine that you might land on an answer in a single lifetime, I think is an infinitesimally insignificant question. It's the wrong question to be asking.
But at the same time, he's not relying on a single lifetime. He's relying on an entire backlog of religious history going back thousands of years.
But he's painting that with his own lifetime. You know what I mean? Like he is impressing his own experience as opposed to trying to judge.
That's true.
That's
only in like one case though. Everything else, he's just looking for contradictions. There was just the one case where they're not.
Decent job. I just don't think he's doing a good job, and he's also evaluating, I think, for the wrong reasons to begin with.
He's doing a great job of what he's setting out to do, but what he's setting out to do isn't finding the right religion. It's finding anything wrong with any individual religion.
Yeah, it's it's disproving all other hypotheses, not proving a hypothesis.
Yeah.
One at a time, or like trying to prove a hypothesis. Yeah.
But he's pretending that his goal is something else.
Yeah. But it makes for fun conversation. It makes for an interesting talking point. It makes for a really fun character. I know that a lot of people are down on Sad Boy Says It, but I disagree. Like it's down to be in his perspective, but it's a fun kind, like not fun. It's an interesting quandary to be in inside of a character's perspective, to be contemplating this strongly.
Mm-hmm. And at the very least, it's making for some really in-depth conversation between you and I.
Yeah. Well, and that to me, I care more about these parts of the conversation than just the character bits, right? Because I think this is really where we can try to detangle what the story is about in a bigger way. Mm-hmm. I love the plot. I love characters. I love things like that. We talk about that a lot. But when you're actually able to extract some form of our interpretation of authorial intent, that's when I think the story gets really good. And to be fair, I think it took a book and a half for us to really get there this time, because I think Mistborn is, I really like it, but it's kind of like munching on a candy bar. It's going to be good, but it's just a candy bar. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying a candy bar, listeners at home, but sometimes you want a little bit more. Sometimes you want, a creme brulee. You want to like enjoy the textures through the entire thing. So moving on from kind of Sad Boy Says It, we talk more with Goridel and the source of these growing brown plants as moments of kind of small hopes for the future and the hard work that it takes to make things like this happen, especially what it's like to work for yourself as opposed to being forced to work, through his perspective on the farm, and talking about his family originally being farmers, kind of the difference of work there. What'd you make of this kind of wholesome moment with Goridel, the man who escaped, who Vin spared, where Kelsier would have killed?
Yeah. I think it's an incredibly important distinction to make that he did. The sort of idea of being forced versus choosing to do a certain task. At the same time, Sazed's kind of obstinate in general about like accepting any sort of philosophical like ideas at this point,
Mm-hmm.
Like
right.
he is weirdly set in his way. And
yeah.
We saw that with the religion, obviously, but this is the first time we've really seen it bleed into anything else, I felt like. And it wasn't like he was pushing back hard, but he didn't like accept the explanation that openly.
Yeah. I think that's a good call. Like he wasn't pushing back hard, but he wasn't accepting of the reality. I like that. I don't think I need to add anything to that. I think that's a good way to pin that tail on that donkey, that Goridel donkey. The reason that I really appreciate Goridel in general and the way that he's made it into the story is that it's almost this act of contrition on the part of Vin for the wrongs of Kelsier at this point, wherein by contrition I mean he would have killed Goridel, and Goridel would have never been here to be he would have never been here in this part of the story if Kelsier were to be in Vin's shoes in that moment. And so it feels like contrition for the earlier part of the story where Kelsier was indiscriminately killing the Ska guards. It's not perfect. That's not what I intended, but it gets the point across.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So Sazed arrives alone at the pits of Hathsin and reunites with the remainder of the Terrace people. It's fascinating that in their eyes, he is this incredible symbol of hope, considering his own hopelessness and dejected path that he's been on throughout the world.
Beyond just his hopelessness, he's felt this sort of heightened sense of anxiety that he should be ostracized and rejected by the Terrace people because he's holding this position as ambassador and therefore is a citizen of the Empire and therefore is a slave to the Empire. Like that's the sort of logic train that he went on to get to that position.
Yeah.
And like, nah, they're excited for him. They're happy to see him. They look up to him. And his self-image is just completely shot, like, and to its core, it's shot, and that sucks.
Yeah, because this is like a moment of coming home. he believed that a lot of the terrorists were killed by that most of the terrorist people were killed by the Inquisitors. So this should be a happy, hopeful moment that there's anyone left to begin with, you know? And instead he's not meeting it with animosity, but he's meeting it with indifference. And that's really unfortunate.
Yeah. I think they said 20,000 people.
Yeah, right.
And half of them male. Most of those males eunuchs. So pretty low prospects of bolstering those numbers, I think.
I'm glad you said it that way. I thought you were going to go the low odds direction. Just a different way of saying the same thing. Okay, chapter 19. We start off here with the logbook. Yes, the ash was black. No, it should not have been. Most common ash has a dark component, but is just as much gray or white as it is black. Ash from the ash mounts, it was different. Like the mists themselves, the ash covering our land was not truly a natural thing. Perhaps it was the influence of ruin's power, as black as preservation was white. Or perhaps it was simply the nature of the ash mounts, which were designed and created specifically to blast ash and smoke into the sky. Can I just say, looking at that description of what we were talking about, that I knew that this was coming last week when you brought up the color of the fucking ash in the episode when we were talking about Breeze wanting to see the rivers painted red and if he was more creative and everything else. I knew that we were going to have this conversation when you brought up the bit about it like being, isn't ash more white than it is black? And I was like, well, it's kind of mixes of both. It's kind of gray. If you smear it, it's white, but if you look at it, it's black.
Yeah. Fuck you. So that conversation, I genuinely can't remember if I kept it in. No, I remember the conversation.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember.
Oh, come on.
I don't remember if I left it in or not.
Okay.
Because it was just a nothing burger of a conversation. So I'm like, I don't think that needs to be in here. So I might have just entirely cut that. And then we published the episode and then I read this. I'm like, fuck.
It's the weird loop of me putting you in charge of like letting you edit episodes is like, I know if it's important or not. You don't know if it's relevant. If I make a funny, tiny side joke, you know, that sometimes gets cut, you know, and I knew that this one was coming because I had actually read through this week's. I think I said that in last week's episode that I had accidentally read through this week's chunk. So
I'm pretty sure I cut it.
Yeah.
Because it didn't matter. Like, it's like, all right, this is like it's a 2-minute conversation that just doesn't matter.
Right. And I totally get the instinct to cut that. And you should generally do that. It's just really funny to me that I knew that this was intentional and it got cut. Like, I only brought it up because I only like responded because I thought it was funny and relevant. Yeah. But God, I mean, fair point. Fair enough. Yeah. I think it's very funny. Did you have anything to pull from this?
So it makes me realize that I've never actually thought about the color of the mists. I've always assumed they were kind of a light gray, kind of like, I don't know, fog, essentially. Like I thought of them as the color of fog, but it could be darker than that, and I just never thought about it. So
that's a fair point. It's an interesting point. I think that this also gives you some semblance of your yin yang answer. Rune's power, as black as preservation's was white, is
pretty explicit,
oblique, but it's explicit. Yeah, it's like it's there. We don't know why it's there, but you're right. Like, we don't know why you're right, but you're right. So cheers. We'll read off that prediction at the end, but that's mine. Cool. All right. So moving forward here. Again, another short chapter. This chunk is really interesting because it's a bunch of short chapters with just that one long Spook chapter. But going into chapter 19 here, Spook without his tin is just so deprived of all of the things that we talked about before, and it's pulled away from him. And it feels like he's sapped. It feels like he's out of energy. It feels like he's empty when we crawl back into his perspective. But he begins to hear a mysterious voice, a powerful voice in his ear that tells him to crawl as the house burns down around him. I'll tell you what, PJ, I know that you're not listening to the audiobook, but this is a moment where listening to the audiobook adds that little extra flair. Where you hear the voice and you're like, wait a minute, is that who I think it is? There's no what? And you just get that moment of like casual realization, just like you do when you're reading it. But it's just because you also recognize the voice, you're just, that's reinforced for you.
Yeah. Honestly, it took me a little while into that section before I realized it was entirely disembodied.
Yeah.
I think on purpose, like by design, but yeah, it was a little bit. So I feel like that would have changed it for me had I recognized a voice that was being spoken.
It's a weird chunk. I really like this chunk, especially in the way that it sounds. It's a 10-minute chapter, 12-minute chapter. So it's really quick and easy to like breeze through. But you know, it's just so fun to hear the voice of Kelsier again. You know, not confirming, but you know, the end of the chapter basically confirms. Come on, yeah, like,
it does confirm it.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
you know who we're talking to.
In Spook's perspective, it confirms it, but
right.
whether or not he's right is up in the air.
Yeah. Spook recounts, count the skulls, which is this note that I think Dern says. And the voice continues to command him to go to the desk. And the voice tells him to burn the metal, to burn this different. And as he downs it, he doesn't feel that familiar surge of tin, and he feels the sense of hopelessness wash over him. He misses his mouth with the first one, just like throws it out over his shoulder.
So it
like shakes out of his hand.
It slips when he's trying to get the cork off, and falls.
Which is why he uses his teeth the second time, is because he can be for sure and like grip it tight. But then he downs it. And the voice tells him to burn the metal. And this is different. This is new. This is a different metal reserve. And he burns it. And he's empowered by pewter.
Yeah. Yes, he is. So this is a pretty amazing revelation that this is possible, first of all. Biggest question now for me is he a Mistborn, being that he can burn multiple? Or do we take the words at face value that he's been imbued with the ability to burn pewter, and that's all he has access to are those two? Also, does him being an allomantic savant affect other metals than just tin, which he's a savant in? Like, that's a question. Is that tied to a single metal, or just his burning abilities, if you want to call it that? Like, I got questions, man.
This chapter poses way more questions than it answers. Yeah. between the mysterious voice and whatnot that's going on inside of this chapter, and this moment in which he burns pewter to make it out and to be able to empower his body to escape. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want answers.
You know, we've been talking about that mysterious figure and voice, and we mentioned it earlier that it's Kelsier, but it is a ghost from his past, and I think you and I both know who it is, and we both assume that it's Kelsier. But what do you make of
it? Says explicitly that it's Kelsier.
It says yes, right.
I mean, that's Spook's perspective. He's looking and hearing at it. Like, he's looking at him and hearing it.
Right.
So we have to assume that he's right, but what we're led to believe and what we're told is that it's Kelsier.
Yes.
It's just whether or not that's a lie or a trick.
Right. What do you think? Do you think it's a trick? Do you think it's a lie? What do you make of it in this moment?
There's a whole lot up in the air on what I believe at this point. Thinking about the possibility of, if I'm going to keep following down that thought process of, is there a well at the pits of Hassin, which granted him his Mistborn abilities and maybe imbued him with something more than just mortality? What does this mean for the Mistspirit from earlier that never spoke and was always following Vin around, which I feel like I might have early on said was Kelsier, but then I also said that Zane was Kelsier. So, you know, like, don't take that as a legitimate, like, it's all scattershot. Like, it's a shotgun approach. I want so badly for it to be not a trick, but I could totally believe that this was a way to co-opt and use Spook on the part of Ruin.
Why do you want it to not be a trick? Like, all that I mean is, like, how does that play out in your head if it weren't a trick?
If it weren't a trick, we've got a whole new situation where we have a supernatural Mistborn that's living outside of death that is benevolent towards our heroes. Like, why wouldn't I want that? From like a rooting for the heroes perspective, of course I want that force on our side.
It was a quantifiable question.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. But I think the more interesting story is knowing that Spook so deeply believes in Kelsier that Ruin takes advantage of that belief and that love and decides to save Spook as a means of more subtle subterfuge against Vin and Elend.
Doesn't that suck?
Who he knows are marching on this city as we speak.
Right.
That seems more likely to me.
They're marching towards Fadrix.
Oh, they are.
Urteau.
This was their
This
next
is where
stop?
no.
This was a previous. Okay.
This is where Sazed is going.
Yep. But they had already taken the city previously.
I don't think so. They had confirmed the cache because of a previous marker, but they have not.
They snuck in
the cache.
They snuck in and got
right.
and looked at it, but they haven't taken anything out of it. Okay,
right. That's right.
But they got all the information from the placards.
Yes, totally what it is.
Okay,
so yeah, cool. All right, so that makes up chapter 19. So we are in our final chapter, chapter 20. We start off with the logbook, of course. More than one person reported feeling a sentient hatred in the mists. This is not necessarily related to the mist killing people, however. For most, even those it struck down, the mist seemed merely a weather phenomenon, no more sentient or vengeful than terrible disease. For some, however, there was more. Those it favored, it swirled around. Those it was hostile to, it pulled away from. Some felt peace within it, others felt hatred. It all came down to Ruin's subtle touch and how much one responded to his promptings.
So, Human has this conversation with Vin regarding
previously, yes,
hatred. And like he mentions that the mists, they know the mists hate them too. I want to know if that was the case before they were under the control of Vin and Elend. Because I think he speaks for the entire Colossus, right? I think he makes mention that like he speaks in plurality at least, as opposed to just him individually. So I wonder if that hatred is a result of them being linked to Vin and Elend, or if it was the case before, and maybe a holdover from like being a creation of the Lord Ruler.
I don't know that I can answer that question.
That's fine. That's just something I'm thinking about.
But in the back of your head, I think you're on an interesting trail, which is what's the delineation between the Lord Ruler's creational influence on these creatures that he's made and Ruin's influence and Preservation's influence? Like where's that line drawn between where these creatures are not coming from, but and not even supplied powered from, but like what are they related to inside of the world?
Who do they belong to?
Yeah, belong. That's a great way of putting it. Totally.
Yeah.
So speaking of creatures inside the world, we are back with our favorite Khandra. I assume Tensoon's your favorite Khandra. Do you have a better option? Better choice? Orsur was a piece of shit.
Yeah, but
just kidding. He
was ours.
He was fine. Okay. for a chapter. It's been Tensoon or die for like at least a book now. Yeah. You just didn't know.
No, I know.
But we're back with Tensoon in the Khandra. He's been locked in a cage, and bizarrely to him, they're trying really hard to prevent him from being able to run, despite his obvious honor inside of this, in which he doesn't want to run. He wants to prove his point more than anything else. What'd you make of the read of this sort of very restrictive, jealous, not jealous, but like, I don't have the words, restrictive action?
Yeah. So I completely get the prospect of wanting to hold your prisoner and keep them confined. But the fact that this specifically is so unprecedented
Yeah.
makes me really think that the firsts are gone, and that this is like the first real act of justice strictly by the seconds. They don't quite know how to, like, they're getting their footing, but like just are a little bit heavy-handed in that respect. And just everything's the second. That's what I'm getting from that, just because it's different. It's just a stark change from what's expected after this judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. Tensoon is not expecting this reaction on any part.
And the fact that it's a month-long wait, like, that was weird and different too. So.
Yeah. And it aligns the timeline in an interesting way too, where we're like, we're bouncing between perspectives, and we know that he's going to be kind of trapped in here. And I think it's what we get inside of this chapter is so important, because it's the beginning of the collective community embarrassment and almost shame that he reaps from being imprisoned in this sort of very disrobing. It just boils down his character, and it boils him down as a person, as a Khandra, into someone who can't be trusted at all.
Right.
Versus like previously they would trust and they would cage in other ways, but this is dehumanizing, but deChandranizing. How does one?
That said,
yeah,
what he did to deserve this is also technically unprecedented. So,
true. Yes. Right.
Like, there's not a direct comparison.
It's not unfounded. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to
it is dualistically
shoot both of our conversations out like at the knees.
Yeah. Right. But there is the argument. There is an argument to be had, and I think that I agree with you on the side of, is this the seconds taking control? What's the issue with the firsts? Like, where's this line lie between the two? So
we haven't seen him.
Right.
We haven't heard from him. We have no actual proof that they are still alive. And we know Khandra can imitate Khandra.
Oh, yeah. True. Interesting.
And who has more experience in the first than the second?
Perhaps. I get very big from the entire section of the Khandra, and we aren't fully through this yet, but I get very big Dark Crystal vibes with the Skeksis, the big raven people that are like full people. You know, the Day 9 sound.
Okay.
That movie. Do you genuinely not know what I'm talking about?
No, I thought you were talking about a book series.
No.
The I know what you're talking about now.
Movie. Okay. All right.
Yep.
Yeah. So I get very heavy like Skeksis community vibes in the way that they like all group in the round circle in the room, and they've got the upper atrium, and they've got people hiding in the background, and you know, kind of like an evil secret society going on. It feels it evokes that vibe for me in these moments. And I think especially in the way that they're treating him as this fellow member that they've never treated anyone else before reminds me of the way that they treat outsiders and treat other people. Yeah. So we get a little world building description of how Mistwraiths become Khandra here as well. And that's a really wonderful note to kind of go off on and talk about. What'd you make of the sort of way that Mistwraiths are nursed into being Khandra?
It's through a blessing, isn't it? Or is that different?
The transformation from Mistwraith to Khandra was a difficult one. Once given a blessing, the Mistwraiths would lose most of its instincts as it gained sentience and would have to relearn how to form muscles and bodies. It was a process that took many, many years. And then it kind of goes in from there. I was just curious. It's a nice world building element to like think about the way that these creatures are kind of nursed.
Roaming bands of infants, essentially.
Right. They're
being led around.
There's no parentage here. They are like literally like roaming bands of infants.
I guess that's why we kind of get this situation with like, it's kind of the duty of one generation to raise another one. So the sevenths, this rebellious group that we're going to deal with, were raised by the thirds. We're the only generation to be raised by the thirds, which is, you know, look how they turned out.
Right.
From the perspective of like the first and seconds, like what the fuck?
Right. Well, and the thirds themselves are very interesting because they are so different. Like we technically have met two thirds, right? We've met Orsor, we met Tensoon. And so we have this kind of it's not idealized, but we have this version of them in our minds as we think about those two characters as Tensoon self-describes, like kind of strict conservatives in the way that they behave, but they're really like outrageous outliers, even from the seconds. So the sort of diaspora that has happened among the various members of the Kandra species is fascinating, especially when you get to like Milan and the groups that are rebelling in the way that they build their true bodies. Like that's where the story gets weird and interesting, is in the way that everyone else has really changed and morphed themselves.
Yeah. Speaking of Milan, at first, early on, like last section, when we first interact with her, I got this real like romantic vibe from her between the two of them. And with that description of sort of the generations raising, it's very much, and just their interactions in this section, it very much feels father-daughter.
Right.
Which is an added sort of weird interaction to put on top of everything and like juggle emotionally, you know? I don't know if I can handle more.
I think it's a really important thing to tackle, though. I agree with you. I think that's the intent here is to make it explicit as to what that was in the previous chapter and to like really define it. And that's to say that Milan is really looking up to Tensoon here, and that's why she's pushing so hard for him to push against these boundaries, because she, as the kid, is like, well, come on, Dad. Like, you can't just like bend over and die. Like, you're not going to fucking do that. I know you. You raised me. And so there's this connotation that's it's wonderful. It's saddening, but it's really important because I think the way that Mistwraiths become Kandra is unique almost entirely to almost any book I've read as far as a species breeds and raises its young. Like, this is such a unique way for a creature to come into the world and be raised. Fascinating.
And at that, like, yes, we get that link to it now, but we don't have how Mistwraiths come about.
True. Right.
Like, we get the adult in the like larval stage, but we don't have
the like egg insemination to some degree. Yeah. Egg insemination. Right.
I wasn't going to go that
well,
like deep about it. I was just going to say egg.
It's fine.
I don't know. Yeah. But every time we get more information, I'm loving it.
Yeah. I really enjoy this book series as a like leverage point for a very big fantasy world. This has been made into a tabletop RPG, and I would adore doing a one shot within this world. I think it'd be a lot of fun.
It would be. Let's do it.
Did you have any other thoughts on Milan and the relationship and kind of the conversation that happens between the two of them? Anything else that kind of tickled at you?
Not specifically that we have.
It's a short chapter. So yeah. It's a couple of pages. Yeah. Nothing crazy. I really enjoyed this week's reading, and I tried to like highlight that in the way that I talked about on the top, where it is sad, it is lore driven, but not in a bad or overhanded way, which I feel like is a lot of what we get here. So I think this is a great example of like striking the right emotional balance, where it's like we realize that the sevenths were raised by the thirds, and that there's this generational gap between Kandra as they grow up. And it's a fascinating thing to like pass on in a weird way inside of this community. So we end every week, of course, with a logbook. So our final logbook here. It should be no surprise that Elend became such a powerful allomancer. It is a well-documented fact, though, that the documentation wasn't available to most, that allomancers were much stronger during the early days of the Final Empire. In those days, an allomancer didn't need Duralumin to take control of a Kandra or Koloss. A simple push or pull on the emotions was enough. In fact, this ability was one of the main reasons that the Kandra devised their contracts with humans, for at the time, not only Mistborn, but soothers and rioters could take control of them at the merest of whims.
Okay, so makes the argument that Elend has become a Mistborn of old, effectively, right? And that's why he's so much more powerful. But that's how Vin was described too.
But in the moment in which she was described like that, she was burning Duralumin. So that's the thing.
Okay,
like she was using that as a cheat. However, she is described that way by Sazed in the first book.
Right, yes. Also, note here, an Allomancer didn't need Duralumin.
Right.
Not a Mistborn didn't need Duralumin.
Right. It's specific. Yeah.
Does that mean like other Allomancers can use Duralumin?
No, I think it's the opposite suggestion, which is to say that rioters and soothers could like old rioters and soothers could get them under the control on their own.
Okay. Yeah.
What I think this points to, if we think about it, if we think about the power of the older generation, is that it leads to the dilution of power over time, which means that people have been getting weaker since the beginning versus like Elend is this like strong point for Mistborn, being that he's kind of a new starting point to some degree.
An iron gold, if you will.
Sure. Yes. Modern iron gold. Yeah. I think that that's kind of what he's pulling at. You know, it's kind of this idea that over time, the dilution of blood and everything else has reduced the power.
Whereas this was imbued
unbridled.
External of blood. So, okay. So, hypothetically, Elend and Vin have children, both being Mistborn at this point. Are their children guaranteed to be Mistborn?
That's a great question that I don't know if there's a firm answer to in terms of genealogy. Think about Elend and his brothers and the many, many offshoots from his dad. I'm sure that he tried and experimented with people that he knew were Allomancers. I'm sure.
I'm not saying Allomancer. I'm saying Mistborn. Straight up Mistborn.
I don't know. I don't know if it's a guarantee. That's a good question. We
need our pundit squares.
Yeah, we do. One would how if we're thinking about Punnett squares, how does internal ingestion of a trait affect a Punnett square? If I eat a thing that makes me a thing, how does that change my chromosomes?
Nugget square.
Or my ability. Yeah. If I eat a nuggie,
it's a nugget square now.
If I eat an elementic nuggie, how does that change my effects here? Cool. All right. Did you have any other thoughts on this logbook? I think it's a fun one that kind of delineates a lot of things.
No, I expressed what I wanted to.
All right. Cool. So with that, we move into PJ's predictions. I want to start off here by like reading through a couple. So we were talking about this all the way back in the Well of Ascension. I asked, all this death and destruction caused by the mist that leaves us with a question we've been pondering for a bit, but we haven't really put anything on. Do you have any suspicions of what's going on with the mist? Why do some live and why do some die? You said,
I have absolutely no idea. Being inside seems to actually help, and they run out of food and starve to death.
The problem is that this prediction wasn't wrong, because being inside at this point, we know does help. It does protect against the mist. The boundaries of places and houses helps to a certain extent. And they do run out of food and starve to death. However, that's not the only thing that's wrong. So I think this is a put.
It's a fucking vague answer I'm drinking for.
All right. Fair point.
Like, I don't know how you let me get away with that being an answer.
You know, sometimes I just had to inside of this book because I couldn't ask you to get more specific because you'd be like, oh, it's more specific. Okay. Like I need to get, are you thinking that I'm on it or am I off it? Like that's part of the problem with some of these. Okay, cool. That's it. That was the only one outside of the one that I drank in the middle of the episode because I definitely asked that question at some point. I'm convinced. So just that one. Very exciting. Very fun time. With that, we close out the episode. Because again, we aren't quite doing questions of the week or next week's questions yet, because we're kind of on a condensed schedule as we had for Hero of Ages. So with that, next week, we are going to be tackling chapters 21 through 29. Again, 21 through 29. This is, I think, the longest reading of this book. I think it's the longest section.
Yeah, 77 pages in the paperback.
Yeah, it's not crazy. We might have one that's 78, including like a weird chapter page, but
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
It should be
cool.
okay.
Right. Should be great. Very excited for what's to come.
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
All right. So that's where we'll leave you for this week.
Thank you, as ever, to Tim and Andrew for helping us keep our shows going. You can check out the links, like all of our links in the show notes. You can find our schedule, Patreon, previous episodes, websites, social media accounts, all in one very convenient location.
That said, we do want to make mention of the new social media accounts that we made mention of at the top of the show. One, Atomic Pylon Media is going to be your home for all information about all the shows that are on our network. That can be found on Twitter and Instagram and shortly Facebook, of which you'll be able to kind of access if you're wanting to follow the larger spectrum of things that we produce and create. Of course, we'll be cross-promoting those. If you follow us on one, you'll probably see other things. Beyond that, we have our new show, Catacomb Party, The Tales of Kana, launching. And it's important that you follow Catacomb Party on Instagram. I think I'm going to make the Twitter account this week for them for us as well. So look out for that. Definitely follow the links like PJ had mentioned within the show notes, including the link to the brand new show that came out yesterday.
Yeah. So I'm excited for people to hear it. Really,
it's our third show publicly released, and it's definitely the most work that we put into a show by far. True. So we hope everyone appreciates it. Again, for those of you who don't know, Tales of Kana, Catacomb Party is a live play D&D show that is then subsequently edited down, including sound effects and other things like that. But it is a improv style D&D campaign show, a la Critical Role and Dimension 20. Yeah. Beyond that, if you want to find just us on social media, we'll be talking about all these other things because we can't help ourselves. You can find us Words Whiskey Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit, and wordsandwhiskeyshow@gmail.com, patreon.com/words and whiskey. And you can find our t-shirts on TeePublic if you search Words and Whiskey or Atomic Pylon Media. Either way, you'd follow all of the links in our description. Beyond that, make sure you give all the shows a follow, and any podcast you like, 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or your podcatcher of choice.
Thank you, everybody, for all of your support. It really does mean the world to us. We will see you next week.
You rock.